Imagine that you are sitting on a mountaintop in the Coast Range, and it's a gorgeous day. You are looking out over the valley, and it's perfectly clear, and you can see forever, and you look around on the other side, and you can look down the hills, and you can turn around and see the ocean. And way down, way across the valley, you see a train coming up the valley, and it's going in and out of the contours and slowly chugging its way up toward you. And you look and you see the tracks down next to the river around you, and goes around to the river and then crosses the river on the trestle. And suddenly you look at the trestle and you realize that it's been washed away. The rails are hanging down into the river, the ties are floating along in the next to the rocks. And you realize that that train that is coming toward you is going to fall in the river. So you run down into town and you run into the door of the train agency and you tell the people, the trestle's down. There's going to be a train wreck. You have to do something. And they say, no. That trestle was designed by the best engineers in the world. It is inspected regularly. There is absolutely nothing the matter with it. And you say, no, I just saw it. I just saw it. There is nothing there. The train is going through it. And they say, no, it can't happen. So then you do what any sensible person would do in that situation, is you start screaming. And you start screaming, it's going to be a train wreck. There is going to be a train wreck. And as you're screaming, there are people outside who hear you, and they start saying, train wreck? There's going to be a train wreck? That is the precise moment at which you become a bigger problem than the train wreck. I live 3 miles up the Adler River. My neighbor across the road is Dyke Dame, who owns the Oreo cookie cows. You know those? My neighbor to the east raises bears. Well, for those of you who don't know, there's a woman who feeds bears, or fed bears, up the river. Dyke came up to me in 1989, and he was very agitated because some guys in orange vests were surveying on his property. And when he went down to ask them what they were doing, they told him that they were surveying for a point of diversion on the river that the city of Yachats was going to use for a pumping station to take more water out of the river for municipal use. And Dyke was agitated first off because they were on his property and hadn't asked, so he thought that was rather rude. And also, both of us knew that the river got rather low. That we wondered, how much water can you take out of the river? And will it be okay? So we both went to the city, and we asked the superintendent of public works what this was all about. And he said, don't worry. It's only a 2 CFS right that we're asking for. We don't need it now. We probably will never need it. And it's not going to be much. A CFS is 633,000 gallons a day. Yeah, it's, what is that? That's 450 gallons a minute. So I stopped worrying about it. Dyke didn't. Dyke started inquiring, and he contacted the Water Resources Department, and he contacted Oregon Trout and people who knew about these things, and he essentially assembled a file because he wanted to know what was going to happen when the city took this water out. I was completely sold out. I didn't care. So I just minded my own business and kept on going until 1992, when the city actually got their permit, and Dyke came up with the file and said, we have to do something about this because they actually are going to be taking water out of the river. And I started looking at his file, and one of the first things I noticed, there was a record of all of the measurements of the amount of water in the river from 1925 on. And there were only like 12 of them. And I noticed that none of them were in September or October when the river was its lowest. I thought, well, that's odd. And so I called Water Resources and asked them, well, so how much water is in the river? You know, I mean, if you're going to be giving 2 CFS to the city of Yachats, how much is going to be left? And they said, oh, enough. I said, well, looking at the water rights that you've issued, it seems to me like you've got more water being taken out of the river than there is river. They said, no, that can't happen. They did say that the river was over-appropriated, but they didn't say that, you know, that it could be dried up. So, of course, I mean, that got my curiosity. I mean, it occurred to me, as it had occurred to Dyke, that these people might not know what they're doing. And that they were just issuing permits without really knowing whether or not there was going to be enough water to satisfy them. So I started checking around to find out if anybody else had read the river. And I found the Water Resources Research Institute at OSU had done a projection study of river levels on the coast. For some reason, I can never find out what it was. But I found out under Yachats that it was projected to have a low flow of 8 CFS. You're going to take a quarter of that. It seemed like an awful lot. I mean, considering we had seen the river fairly low, and if they were going to take a quarter of it, I mean, you're going to see a lot of rock. So from about 92 to 94 or something, I started asking around to people. I really didn't know. I mean, can you really harm a river by taking out, obviously you can harm by taking out all the water, but you know, how low can it get? And I found a man by the name of Mark Campbell, who was a PhD water biologist who had been doing a study down at 10 Mile. And I asked him, what happens to rivers if you get them too low? And his response was, you can do it on a fairly regular basis for short periods of time. But if you do it on a regular basis over a long period of time, you can really wreck the river. It will never recover, never recover. And he referred me to a man who at the time was a fisheries biologist at the Forest Service. And I went and asked him, you know, so what do you know? And he said something that really kind of determined my life for the next 15 years. He said that rivers can get to a point, if you take too much water out of them, they begin to consume themselves. And that knocked me over. I couldn't live with that phrase. I was imagining, well, what happened if we are screwing up here? And we are taking too much water out of this river, and we actually end up destroying it. Somebody should probably take a look at this.